الله وبركاته.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه اللهم مقاما محمودا الذي وعد إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters in Islam, 23 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's first encounter with Jibreel alayhi salam in the cave of Hira in the city of Mecca, where he was given the most powerful command that any human being could be given, which was Iqra, read. The most powerful command that any human being has ever been given is the command to read. And how much are we in need of that instruction in today's time? Read, Iqra, read. The Prophet ﷺ gave what could be considered one of the most comprehensive, if not the most comprehensive and impactful and socially relevant address in the history of the prophets and messengers. In the history of the prophets and messengers, no man has ever been able to capture with so much simplicity and relevance and clarity the dilemma of our human experience like Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in his farewell khutbah, in his last sermon, his last address, not to just the Muslim community, but to the entire world. No man in the history has ever been able to capture with such simplicity and social relevance and clarity the dilemma of the human experience like Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in his farewell khutbah. It was estimated that there were over 140,000 companions who gathered to perform Hajj with the Prophet ﷺ, as well as listen to his farewell khutbah, his last and final address, not to the Muslim community, but to the entire world. because this address would go on many years later, hundreds of years later, would go on to be used by many Muslims and non-Muslims to help them navigate this world and the problems and the challenges that face us as human beings. Many non-Muslims have taken from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's last address and have implemented it in their societies, in their governments, in their governance of their society, in order to establish justice amongst the people that they govern. Over 140,000 people. That might not seem as a lot in this day and time. We have more than 140,000 people maybe at a football stadium or at a concert for things that bring people no sense of awareness of what's going on around them. And that is because in today's time, we flock to conferences, we flock to, concerts, we flock to places in such, numbers, in droves, places that bring us no awareness of ourselves, no awareness of the world that is around us, nor the atrocities and the injustices that go on inside of it. But during that time, we're talking about 140,000 listeners, many of whom were going to go and after that sermon was over and begin to implement the message of the Prophet ﷺ in their own personal lives. Many of whom would go on to become governors and leaders of their respective environments and their respective, endeavors. They would go on to be leaders implementing the Prophet ﷺ's last sermon, the advices that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in his last address. So we're not talking about just 140,000 listeners, 140,000 followers. We're talking about 140,000 individuals who were later on going to take that message and begin implementing it. That is powerful. That is powerful. And this sermon would ultimately be the first and the last, as the first Hajj and the last Hajj that the Prophet ﷺ made was in this Hajj. The Prophet ﷺ only made Hajj one time in his life. So this would end up being the first and the last time the Prophet ﷺ ever made Hajj. And it would be the last time that he would ever address the Muslim community. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said to them at the beginning of his sermon, he said, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, isma'u minni ubayyin lakum. O people, listen to me. I'm going to clarify to you. I'm going to sum up my entire mission of 23 years in just a few minutes. I'm going to sum up my entire mission of 23 years in just a few words. And this was one of the miracles of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, something that we have been deprived of in today's time. It may take us an hour, 2 hours talking to get a point across. And even getting a point across after an hour, you'll still have people walking away saying, I didn't understand. I really didn't get it. I wish you would have explained more. Because we still don't get it, because we don't listen to understand. We listen to respond. We listen to, comment. This is what we have become, a nation of commentators. That's what we have become today, because we don't listen to understand. We don't listen to process. We don't listen to practice. We don't listen to implement. We listen to give you our take on what you said. We listen because what you said struck a nerve with me, and I need to attack you because you triggered me by your words. This is why we respond. We don't listen today in order to understand. But one of the Prophet ﷺ's miracles was called Jawami al-Kalim, and that was the ability to use such prolific, such, beautiful and comprehensive phrases and such very short sentences. That was the miracle of the Prophet ﷺ. The miracle, one of the many miracles of the Prophet ﷺ was Jawami al-Kalim, the ability to use small phrases, but they are very comprehensive. But in this khutbah, the Prophet ﷺ summed up his entire mission in just a few moments. And he said, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, isma'u minni, listen to me, ubayyin lakum, I'm going to clarify to you, I'm going to explain to you our dilemma. فإني لا أدري لعلي لا ألقاكم بعد عام هذا في موقفكم هذا. He said, because perhaps I will never meet with you again like this. I will never have another opportunity to meet with you again like this. I will never have another opportunity to meet with you after today in this very same place, which was the day of Arafah. Some scholars say he was on Arafah when he gave this khutbah, and some scholars say he was in Mina. Nonetheless, it was during Hajj when he gave this farewell khutbah. But you can hear that the Prophet ﷺ, he knew that he was never going to meet with the Sahaba again. And I am calling on all khatibs, all imams, all students of knowledge, when you mount the mimbar, every single khutbah that you give should be given with the type of energy, with the type of vigor, with the type of enthusiasm, as if you know that you may never stand on another mimbar again. I think that we take the mimbar for granted. We take it for granted how powerful it is to stand in a place and have people forced by the necessity of their religious obligation to listen to you. Forced by the religious obligation. Many people come to the masjid on Jummah simply because it's a religious obligation. Nonetheless, you have to be there. And I think many imams take it for granted, the power that they have on the mimbar to address the community who have no other choice but to listen to you, no matter how much they dislike you, no matter how much they dislike what you're saying. It's a religious obligation that you have to sit there and listen. Very important. But the Prophet ﷺ said, perhaps I will not meet with you guys again after this. Fi mawqifikum hadha, in the same spot. Perhaps we may never meet again. And they never met again. This happened during the month of Hajj. The Prophet ﷺ died almost three months and 3 weeks later after this khutbah. The Prophet ﷺ died on Monday, the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal, which was 3 months. Dhul Hijjah is the last month on the Islamic calendar. The last month on the Islamic calendar, 3 months into the new year, into the 11th year after Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called him back. He knew that he was not going to see them again, because in that year, Angel Jibreel alayhi salam came down twice in the month of Ramadan to review the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ. So he knew that this was his last year. He knew when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Surah An-Nasr, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. He knew when the revelation of Surah An-Nasr was revealed that his death was imminent. That his demise was imminent. That death was right around the corner for him. He knew that. And so he mounted the mimbar with the understanding that I may never have another opportunity to address you. So I'm going to make sure that I lay it all out, so that before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I am free of blame. As he kept saying throughout his khutbah, he kept saying, Allahumma hal balagh. Oh Allah, have I not conveyed your message? Allahumma shahad. Oh Allah, bear witness that I have conveyed your message. Throughout his khutbah, he kept stopping, saying, hal balagh. Have I not conveyed to you the message? Allahumma shahad. Oh Allah, bear witness, so that I am free in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the mentality of the imam, of a student of knowledge who is serious about his position, who seeks to perfect his craft as an imam, as a student of knowledge, as a leader in the Islamic community. The Prophet ﷺ's voice could be heard by everyone without even using a device that would elevate his voice. The whole 140,000 people who were standing there could hear the Prophet ﷺ's voice without the use of a microphone. Subhanallah. And that is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who lifts the voices. Ar-Rafi'. Allah is the raiser, the elevator. The one who elevates voices to go beyond the scope of where he or she is at that moment. But the Prophet ﷺ's voice could be heard by everyone without the use of any device. Not because his voice was loud. It wasn't because his voice was loud. It was because he had the attention of the people. People wanted to listen. People waited to listen. People were intently listening because they wanted to hear what he had to say. He had the voice of the people. And when you have the voice of the people, that is the moment that you strike. that is the moment that you take advantage of the opportunity because you have the voice of the people. Muslims, we have the voice of the people. Throughout coronavirus, the pandemic of coronavirus, throughout this, the riots and the protests that we see going on, we have the voice, we have the ears of the people. And if we don't strike now, if we do not take advantage of the opportunity right now, we will allow the opportunity to slip right through our fingers. You have to ask yourself, how is it that this world can be in such chaos and the Quran, the greatest miracle given to any prophet and messenger, is still alive and well amongst us? How is it that the Quran is still here? How is it that the Quran is still on earth and we still have anarchy and chaos? How? Wallah al-Azim, we have to answer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that. We, as Muslims, we have to answer to Allah for that. How is it that there's so much injustice, oppression, persecution, discrimination, prejudice? How is all of these vices existing in a world where the Quran is existing? How? Because the Muslims are not upholding the Quran. That's why. How is it? So if today's time, the Quran is in almost every single household. I know non-Muslims who have the Quran in their homes. Non-Muslims who have the Quran in their homes. How is it that the Quran is in almost every home on this planet, yet this planet, this world is filled with so much injustice and anarchy and chaos and prejudice and discrimination? How? So what's going to happen when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes the Quran from the earth? If this is the way that the world looks with the Quran in it, then what will the world look with the Quran out of it? La ilaha illallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only knows. God only knows what this world will look like when the Quran is removed. The Prophet ﷺ said, يُصْبِحُ النَّاسِ كَالْبَهَائِمِ, that the people will be like animals. People act like animals right now, even while the Quran is here. Can you only imagine? You can only imagine what people will resort to when the Quran is absent. And the whole reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove the Quran from the earth is because no one acts upon it anymore. No one cares about it anymore. No one reads it anymore. No one understands it anymore. No one implements it anymore. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove it from the earth. Allah's words are far too precious to remain amongst a group of people who don't take advantage of it, who take them for granted. We throw the Quran behind our backs as Bani Israel did with the Torah. We have thrown the Qurans behind our backs. Wallah al-Azim, we got to threaten Muslims. We got to impose on Muslims to even speak out against injustice. That's where we are today. That is where we are today. Meanwhile, in our book, from the beginning to the end, you can hardly pass by a surah in the Quran, 114 chapters in the Quran, except that injustice is mentioned in a dispraiseworthy manner. Injustice and prejudice and discrimination is mentioned, whether it is in examples of past nations that had came before, or whether it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warning this nation against the same things. And yet today you have to almost strangle a Muslim to open his mouth and speak out against injustice. We don't even speak out against the injustices that go on in our own community, much less the injustices that's going on out in the greater world around us. La ilaha illallah. Wallah al-Azim, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. Wallah al-Azim, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. We have to take directions from scholars who live in other countries to tell us, to give us the stamp of approval that it is okay for you to speak about issues that are related to your society. La ilaha illallah. But the Prophet ﷺ, he had the attention of the people. Not just because he was a prophet. He didn't have the attention of the people just because he was a prophet, but he had the attention of the people because he was a champion of the people. He was a people's champion. When the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca without one sword, he conquered Mecca, no sword in his hand. And people were afraid. that the Prophet ﷺ would lay siege to Mecca. Many of Quraysh were terrified, were scared that he was going to come with over 10,000 soldiers and he was going to lay siege to Mecca because they were aware of the atrocities that they were guilty of. Similar to the white fragility that white people today are aware of. They are afraid of black people. They are terrified of black people. When in fact, when you think about all of the horrendous crimes and murders that go on in this country, is not done by black people. We're talking about your Jeffrey Dahmers, where you're biting off the heads of people. You're putting heads into a refrigerator. You're eating body parts. That's not done by black people. Even now with the looting, you look at the looting, all of what the TV is showing you is black people looting, but they don't show you, including white police officers who they themselves are looting. We are not America's biggest threat. They are. Black skin, melanin is not America's biggest threat. White people who function without a conscience of God is the biggest threat to America. They are the biggest threat to America. You remove God consciousness and you can expect nothing. As the scholars say, laysa ba'da kufr them. Laysa them ba'da kufr. That after disbelief in God, you can expect anything from an individual. After disbelief in God, you can expect anything from an individual. And there's none more godly on this planet, on this earth. And you can look through the history books that will show you the ungodliness of white supremacy. And that's not judging all white people, but even all white people benefit from the system of white supremacy. So whether you are directly involved or indirectly involved, you are involved. But the Meccans, they were aware of the atrocities that they were guilty of. The blood of the slaves that they had spilled, the torture, the persecution, the oppression of anyone who uttered La ilaha illallah, as Allah says in the Quran, أَتَقْتُلُونَ رَجُلًا أَن يَقُولَ رَبِّيَ اللَّهُ. Will you kill a man simply because he said, my Lord is one, my God is one? Anyone who uttered La ilaha illallah that came from the lower tiers of society that didn't have tribes to defend them and protect them, they were subjected to persecution, oppression, discrimination on levels. Wallahu bihi alim. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more knowledgeable of than we are. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after approaching Mecca with no sword in hand, Meccans are afraid. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam stood on the door of the Kaaba, the same Kaaba that he was prevented from praying in front of, the same Kaaba when he was making sujood. Abu Jahl ordered one of his slaves to go get a bucket of pig intestines and pour it on the back of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam while he was in sujood. The same Kaaba that Umar radiallahu anhu, when he took his shahada, said, I'm going to the Kaaba and pray. Any one of you of Quraysh who want to lose your life tonight, follow me to the Kaaba and pray and disturb me while I'm making salat. Anybody who want to lose their life tonight, follow me to the Kaaba. And I promise you, you disturb me while I'm praying, I promise you, I'm going to send you to your maker. The same Kaaba, the Prophet ﷺ stood at the Kaaba. And he said to them, Ya ma'shara Quraysh, O Quraysh, ma tarawna anni fa'ilun bikum. What do you think I'm going to do with you? Now he's in a position of power. Now he's in a position of authority, where he now has the authority. And this is where the test of a man's character comes from. Your test is not how you treat your friends. The test of a man's character is how do you treat your enemies when you have authority over them. When you are now in the position of authority, how do you treat your enemies? That is the test of your character. The Prophet ﷺ asked them, Ya ma'shar Quraysh, ma tarawna anni fa'ilun bikum. What do you think I'm going to do with you now? So they started copping pleas. قالوا خيرا أخ كريم ابن أخ كريم. They said, we only expect anything but good from you. Oh, our noble brother, son of our noble brother. You don't have to plead with me. You don't have to cop pleas to me. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, اذهبوا فأنتم طلقاء. He said, go, you're free. You're free. You're free. I'm not in the business of enslaving people. For all people who say, oh, Prophet Muhammad has slaves, Prophet Muhammad enslaved people. He told the Meccans, اذهبوا فأنتم طلقاء. Go, you are free.
No.
The message of La ilaha illallah is a message of liberation. Why in a world would a man who's calling the world to liberate themselves from the world and all of the shackles that the world can offer you? With one word, La ilaha illallah. There's no God worthy of worship except Allah. Why would a man who is pontificating a message of liberation of all sorts seek to enslave people? For all the people who say, oh, Muhammad had slaves, the Arabs had slaves. The message of La ilaha illallah is a message of servitude to God and God only. That's it. It's a message of servitude to God and God only. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he even gave Abu Sufyan, a man who had previously spared no opportunity to torture and to, oppress and to deal injustice to the Muslims in Mecca, the early Muslim community. He showed solidarity with his fellow chiefs in waging war against Islam and the Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ even gave Abu Sufyan a position, so as to not dismiss his glory days as a chief and to let him see that his good in Jahiliyyah will not go unnoticed or unrecognized in Islam. As the Prophet ﷺ said, خيركم خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام إذا فقهوا, that the best of you in Jahiliyyah, those of you who had good qualities prior to Islam, will be recognized for those good qualities in Islam, provided you get an understanding of the religion, provided you do not rely on your previous reputation to give you credence, but you learn your religion. But the Prophet ﷺ even gave Abu Sufyan a position. This shows you that he was a people's champion. Abbas, when Abu Sufyan took his shahada and they saw the Muslims coming from Medina to Mecca, Abbas went to the Prophet ﷺ and pleaded with him. He said, Ya Rasulullah, inna Aba Sufyan rajulun yuhibbu al-fakhr fa'a'tihi shay'. He said, oh Messenger of Allah, Abu Sufyan is a man who loves status. He comes from status. He's one of the chiefs of Quraysh. Give him something in Islam so that he can maintain that status, so people don't see him less than. The Prophet ﷺ said, Man dakhala abayta Abi Sufyan fahuwa aman. Whoever enters into the house of Abu Sufyan, then he is safe. You know what Abu Sufyan did? Abu Sufyan ran ahead of the Muslim community, ran to Mecca and went knocking door to door. Prophet Muhammad said, whoever comes into my house, he's safe. Prophet Muhammad said, whoever comes into my house, he's safe. He gave Abu Sufyan a status. He was a people's champion. This is despite all of the atrocities that Abu Sufyan was guilty of up until that point. He was a people's champion. That is why he had the ear of the people. That is why he had the attention of the people. The Prophet ﷺ, he restored all that was taken away from many of those who came from the lower tiers of Meccan society, like Bilal ibn Abi Rabah. He restored what was taken from him, from his dignity, from his honor as a human being. Before Islam, Bilal held no title. He was a slave, a shepherd who used to sheep herd for some of the chiefs of Quraysh for just a handful of dates. That's all they paid him. Dates, here you go. Meanwhile, he's in the desert all day long slaving for just a handful of dates. And the Prophet ﷺ restored his honor to him. After conquering Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ looked around and saw the crowd and he said, Aina Bilal? Where's Bilal ibn Abi Rabah? Bilal said, Ana huna, ya Rasulullah, I'm here, O Messenger of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ said, Ya Bilal, is'ad al-Kaaba wa adhin fi nas. He said, Oh Bilal, climb on top of the Kaaba and call the adhan. Out of all of the people there, why did the Prophet ﷺ select Bilal? Why? Even as Bilal began to climb up the Kaaba, which was a staple in even pre-Islamic society. Even some of the chiefs of Mecca were standing there watching this black slave climb on top of the Kaaba. Some of the chiefs began to whisper amongst themselves, look at this. I'm glad so-and-so is dead, so he's not even alive to see this black slave climb on top of the Kaaba. Bilal got on the Kaaba, I got on top of the Kaaba and began to call the adhan in the sweetest voice. And so now, all of those who used to look down on Bilal now had to look up at him. All of the people who looked down on him, he's just a black slave from Abyssinia, from Ethiopia, not worth much, will work for just a handful of dates. We can stone him, we can beat him, we can kick him, spit on him, make him sleep in the barn with the animals. He's nothing. And the Prophet ﷺ took him and gave him something. You understand? He was a people's champion. He championed the cause of the people. That is why he had the attention of the world. He used to give away sadaqah to some of the Bedouin Arabs. And they would take shahada just because he would give them money. And they would run back to their tribes and they would say, go to Muhammad, embrace Islam. Muhammad gives away money like a man who doesn't care about poverty, because he really didn't care about poverty. His lifestyle was a choice, not circumstantial. The Prophet ﷺ said that Allah, arada alayya rabbi, that my Lord made me an offer to give me a valley in Mecca filled with gold. And the Prophet ﷺ said, la ya rabbi, no, O my Lord, I'm content with being exactly the way that I am. He said, I'm content with having some days and not having some the other days. He said, on the days when I have, ashkuruka wa ahmadak. He said, on the days that I have, I will praise you and I'll be grateful to you. And on the days that I don't have, da'autuka wa tadarra'tu ilayk. That the days that I don't have, I will call on you and I will humble myself before you. I'm okay with that. I don't need a valley in Mecca filled with gold. I don't need to be a king. I don't need to be all of these great titles that all of us are in search of, looking for validation. Those things don't validate me. Money doesn't validate me. Status doesn't validate me. I am who I am because of my belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and because of my due diligence in doing good to my fellow neighbors. That is where I derive my validation from. Not from status, not from money, not from praise, not from followers, not from Twitter, not from Instagram, not from Facebook. That's not where I derive my validation from. My validation comes from my relationship with God and how that relationship with God manifests in the way that I deal with my fellow humans. That is where my validation comes from. But the Prophet ﷺ told Bilal, stand on top of the Kaaba, call the adhan. So now everybody who used to look down on him can now look up to him. And everybody who never heard his voice before, when Bilal cried from the torture, when Bilal was put in the middle of the desert on his back in hot sand and a boulder was put on his chest, and they told Bilal, all you have to do is just say you believe in Latin Uzza and we'll let you go. And Bilal, anhu, he said nothing more than Ahad, Ahad, Allah is one, God is one, God is one. That's it. And he was tortured for that. Nobody heard his cries when he was being tortured. Nobody heard his cries when he was being oppressed. Nobody heard his cries when he was dismissed as a human being. And now everybody could hear his voice. We can still hear the voice of Bilal now to this very day when we hear the adhan. It is a reminder. Every time you hear the adhan, I want you to remember Bilal ibn Abi Rabah. Every time you hear someone on the minbar hear someone in the masjid call the adhan, I want you to think about the voice of Bilal alayhi salam, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who before nobody heard his voice, now everybody can hear his voice. The same way that we even hear the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam today, even 1,441 years later. بارك الله لي ولكم في القرآن العظيم ونفعني وإياكم بما جاء فيه من الآيات والذكر الحكيم. أقول ما تسمعون أستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المؤمنين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له إقرارا به وتوحيدا وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله سراجا منيرا. The same way that we can hear the voice of Bilal, the same way that we can hear the voice of Bilal, the same way that we can hear the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even at over 1,000 years distance between us and him, we can still hear it. The same way that the black people in America have been screaming for justice for years, have been screaming for equality for years, have been screaming for peace for years, for centuries. For hundreds of years in this country, we have been screaming, we have been lifting our voices, and our voices have been ignored for so long. Many of the immigrants that have come here to this country have come here, built their societies, built their communities off the backs of African Americans and Black Americans, Native Americans, Aboriginals, have built their communities, built their societies. So why they sit in their homes today, why their children go to prestigious universities today, and why they can sit from a place of privilege and say, black people have been in this country from the beginning and they still have nothing. They can sit from a place of privilege and say that today. Meanwhile, every single thing that you have has been built off the backs, the blood, the sweat, the tears of the people who were here first. But you sit from a place of privilege and say, what's wrong with black people? Why don't they have this? Why don't they have that? They were here way before here. My father came here 20 years ago. My parents came here 30 years ago. And now we're doing fine. The systematic racism is what has afforded you the privilege and the opportunity to say the things that come out of your mouth. And you don't realize how dismissive it is, how disrespectful it is. And now African Americans, Black Americans have been screaming for justice, screaming for equality, screaming for peace for generations, and people were not hearing us, but I guarantee you they hear us now. Oh, they hear us now. People are protesting today in Germany, in Paris, in France, in the UK, in Canada. Our voices are finally being heard. Our voices are being heard. Back in the 60s, when Martin Luther King, they were doing nonviolent protests and dogs were sicked on African Americans. Hoses, water hoses were put out on African Americans. The world watched, but nobody said anything. Nobody heard us. Malcolm X tried to go outside of America and establish alliances as a representative of African Americans. Tried to establish alliances with Gaddafi and other leaders throughout Africa so that he could get them to see the atrocities that America was guilty of. And although people saw it, people heard it, they didn't hear our voices, but they hear us today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rafi'. Allah is the elevator. Allah lifts, and he can even lift voices so that they are heard all around the world. Even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Prophet Ibrahim, وَأَذِّن فِي النَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ يَأْتُوكَ رِجَالًا وَعَلَى كُلِّ ضَامِرٍ يَأْتِينَ مِنْ كُلِّ فَجٍّ عَمِيقٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Prophet Ibrahim, وَأَذِّن فِي النَّاسِ, and it conveyed to the people to come and perform Hajj. Allah commanded Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to command the people to come and perform Hajj. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, man yuballighu sawti. Oh my Lord, who can convey my voice? I'm only one person. How are you going to get the whole world to hear me? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Ibrahim, Adhin wa alayya al-balagh. All you got to do is call, and I will be responsible for making sure that your voice is heard. All we got to do is call on Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make sure that our voices are heard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has heard the voices of the oppressed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has heard the voices of the oppressed in this country. I can't speak for what goes, the oppression and the injustices that go on around the world, and God knows they go on in almost every single corner of the world. But he has heard our voices. And if you are an African American imam or student of knowledge at this point and you cannot see that, you are going to end up on the wrong side of history. I promise you. I promise you. You still advocating, oh, don't protest, don't say nothing, that don't have anything to do with us, that are non-Muslims fighting against non-Muslims. This is what Muslims are saying. Some African American as well. Like this is not our fight. This is not our issue. Obviously, if you're a white convert, I totally understand. I totally get it. It's not your fight. Step to the side. But don't be putting out information to the communities telling people not to get involved. The momentum is going. Seize the opportunity. Take advantage of the opportunity. And we're taking advantage of the opportunity now in the Muslim community. Because there's racism, systematic racism that go on even in the Muslim community here in America. And so while we are addressing racism and white supremacy and the systematic process of racism and prejudice and discrimination at the larger community level, then we are also addressing it at the smaller Islamic community level. Oh, we're going to address it here too. And for all of our Islamic leaders, our non-black, non-African American leaders, Muslim leaders who are advocating justice for African Americans, what you need to advocate for is justice for African American Muslims within the Muslim community. Here again, the selective activism. The selective activism. You can't put out a post and say, well, I stand with African Americans. I stand in solidarity with African Americans and the injustices that they have been subject to. But right now, even within the Muslim community, you cooperate with organizations. You work with Islamic organizations that continuously dismiss African American Muslims. Continuously ignore the plight of African American Muslims. Continuously ignore the struggle of African American Muslims. Continuously show discrimination between African American Muslims. It's selective activism, man. Don't come at me sideways asking me why you say this about this one, why you say this about that one. Check yourself in your own understanding of what activism really looks like. You can't pick and choose, cherry pick and choose what you're going to address and what you're not going to address. Yes, you still have affiliations and associations with Islamic organizations that are hell-bent on constantly dismissing the African-American Muslim experience. You have to be kidding me, man. You got to be kidding me. You can't be an African American and you're talking about, oh, protesting, I'm here for it, I'm all for it, yet ISNA reach out to you and you know the crimes of these organizations and you still go because, you know, they're going to pay you. They're going to give you a platform. Nah, man. That's selective activism, man. And some of you Muslim celebrity imams, poets, poetess, and whatever title you want to give yourself. Creator, you know, content creators, you better get your stuff together, man. You guys better get your stuff together and stop jumping out here on these platforms just talking recklessly because you're going to get checked. You're going to get checked. Don't think that your comments, don't think that you're pandering and you're placating. That stuff doesn't go unnoticed. People see you for who you are. People see you for who you are. Some of you are young, some of you are immature, and some of you haven't really you have not conceptualized the whole entire mission. So as a result, you jump in, you jump out, you pick and choose, but you're going to get yourself caught up. You're going to get yourself caught up. I suggest you sit with some of the elders, and I suggest you culture yourself first before you jump out there and start talking about what you for, what you not for. I suggest that you find yourself first before you jump out there and talk about what you for and what you not for. Because quiet is kept. If social media didn't exist, some of you wouldn't exist. That's a fact. If social media didn't exist, many of you would not exist. You would be a non-factor to the Muslim community. The only reason why many of you have a voice and the only reason why many of you have a platform is because social media exists. Take away social media, you disappear. Poof, gone. I was around before social media. My voice is the same as it was 20 years ago as it is right now. That's not to put myself on a higher pedestal. But prior to social media, prior to Instagram, where were you prior to Instagram? You're still in high school somewhere, still in middle school somewhere. And now that you have a platform, you use your platform to cherry pick and choose what you're going to get involved in. Nah, man, you need to find yourself. You need to find yourself. You need to conceptualize the whole entire mission before you jump out there and make a fool of yourself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He allowed Ibrahim alayhi salam's voice to be heard. Not just within that locality, but even today. Look at the millions of Muslims who go and perform Hajj today. They have heard the call of Ibrahim. Even though they didn't hear it literally, they hear the call of Ibrahim alayhi salam because Allah is the one who carries the voices to the places where they need to go. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam lived amongst his people both before revelation and after, and was aware of the social fabric that encapsulated them there in Mecca. He was aware that although he had exemplified every command given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, changing the cultural habits and traditions of the pre-Islamic Arab community was something that was not going to be done in a 23-year period. He understood that. The Prophet ﷺ understood that the conditions, the cultural habits and traditions of the pre-Islamic era of the Arab community that conflict with the quality of life that Islam proposes for all people. He knew that he wasn't going to be able to change that in 23 years. These traditions, as oppressive as they were rooted in the minds and the psyches and the hearts of the people in Mecca. Even as they transitioned spiritually from shirk to Islam, from shirk to tawheed, from idolatry to, monotheism. And they did not denounce all forms of injustice. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Hadith al-Qudsi, إِنِّي حَرَّمْتُ الظُّلْمَ عَلَى نَفْسِي وَجَعَلْتُهُ بَيْنَكُمْ مُحَرَّمًا فَلَا تُظَالَمُوا. He said, indeed, I have made injustice, oppression, haram upon me. This is God saying this, that God is not going to oppress anyone. وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا. And your Lord will not oppress anyone. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that indeed I have made dhulm, I have made oppression haram on me. And I have made it haram between you, so don't oppress one another. And even as many of the Sahaba begin transitioning spiritually from shirk to tawheed, from polytheism to monotheism, a lot of the pre-Islamic traditions and cultures had not been eradicated. And the Prophet ﷺ knew that all of it wasn't going to be eradicated within the short amount of time that was allotted to him. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Arba' min fi ummati min amr al-jahiliyyah la yatrukuhunna." He said, there are 4 things that are from the pre-Islamic period of ignorance that my ummah, some from amongst my ummah, will never stop doing it. These are cultural traditions and habits that are oppressive, that are unjust, that the Prophet ﷺ knew that his people would never eradicate. And when he said, my ummah, when the Prophet ﷺ says, my ummah, the scholars say that means 2 things. Ummat al-da'wah wa ummat al-istijaba. Ummat al-da'wah, meaning he's talking about the people that he was addressing, meaning the Arabs. And then there's ummat al-istijaba. And then there's ummah that is used when he is referring to the people who responded to his message, meaning the Muslim community. So when the Prophet ﷺ says the word my ummah, sometimes he's referring to the Arabs, and sometimes he is referring to those who responded to the message of Islam, and those are the Muslims. So when the Prophet ﷺ said, Arba' fi ummati la yatrukuhunna, there are 4 things that my ummah will never leave. There are 4 things from my ummah, 4 things that my community will never stop doing. Who is he referring to? Is he referring to the Muslims in general, or is he referring to the Arabs in more specific? He's referring to the Arabs. And this is something, the 4 things that he mentioned, many of Arab societies, they still do this to this day. The Prophet ﷺ said 4 things that my ummah will never stop doing. And they're kufr, they're disbelief, but they're still going to do it anyway. He said the first one, he said, al-fakhru fil ahsab, is bragging and boasting about your social status. Bragging and boasting about your family status. What your last name is. I'm Fulani, I'm Fulani, I'm Fulani, your last name. And that gives you credence in certain societies. In certain societies, you can throw your last name out there. I'm this, I'm that. From this tribe or that tribe. And, you'll be free to do as you like. You're free to do as you like. Those of you who are from Arab cultures, from South Asian cultures, you know better than I do. You know better than I do that there are certain environments, certain situations where you can throw your last name out there and a pass will be given to you. Al-fakhr fil ahsab is to brag and boast about your family status. Al-ta'n fil ansab, and to insult people because of their lineage. And here we had a Somali imam get on a minbar and insult an entire nation of African Americans about their lineage and where they come from, that they're bastard children. Here we go. I hate to keep bringing that up, but it's just such a slap in the face and it has gone unaddressed. Person apologizes and we keep it moving, but we never stop to address. We never stop to address it on a global, on a community level. Person just says, I apologize, I'm sorry for offending you, and we just keep it moving. But that doesn't solve the problem. We need to have a conversation. We need to have a talk. We need to have a discussion as it relates to why this is happening. Why does a person feel so comfortable and so okay to say that? وَالطَّعْنْ فِي الْأَنْسَابِ, to insult people because of their lineage. 4 things that my ummah will never stop doing. Bragging and boasting about their family status. Insulting people because of their lineage. وَالْإِسْتِسْقَى بِالنُّجُومِ, and to, say that astrology, to say that you have, this happened because of that star, this happened because of that star. You have Muslims now, I'm Sagittarius, I'm Leo, I'm this, I'm that. And you attribute a lot of your personality and who you are based upon your month of birth. We still do that till today. And the last one is an-niyaha al-mayyit, is hollering and screaming and wailing over the death of a loved one. There's a tradition in Saudi Arabia, even right now, that when a person dies, they set up chairs and they set up lights and things like that. And they have 7 days of mourning outside and they having food or whatever. A tradition that the Prophet ﷺ sitting around talking about the deceased, all of the conversations about the deceased. This is something that even scholars within that environment have warned against. Yet it's still something that is celebrated, something that is done by most in that environment. Because they're not going to stop. Things that they are not going to leave off. Things that they are not going to, cultural habits and traditions. So while Muslims dismiss the discussion on racism altogether, I'm going to end here. As Muslims, many Muslims dismiss the discussion on racism altogether by hollering, oh, there's no racism in Islam. Let me put this to bed right now. Let me end this argument, this discussion right now. I don't ever want to hear another Muslim say there's no racism in Islam. You know why? Because that statement is so disrespectful and so dismissive of the racism that does exist amongst Muslims. No, there's no racism in Islam, but don't use that as a smokescreen to overshadow the fact that some Muslims, many Muslims, are racist. And that's a fact. That's a fact. So don't say there's no racism in Islam. Obviously, we know that there's no racism in Islam, but don't use that as a means of dismissing the fact that racism is alive and well amongst many Muslims. Amongst many. And the sad thing about it is that you have African Americans who say that. African Americans who will tell you, oh, there's no racism in Islam. I'm not talking about racism in Islam. Obviously, there's no racism in the Quran. There's no racism in this book here. And there's no racism in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about racism that is alive and well amongst Muslims, human beings, individuals. It's dismissive. And what we'll do is we'll highlight incidents, isolated incidents. Like I seen a post that was put up on Twitter of, maybe the king of Saudi Arabia kissing a black person on the forehead. And we'll use that to say, see, Saudi Arabia is not racist. One of the most racist societies in the Muslim community. You have got to be kidding me. And we'll highlight, oh, I have never experienced racism. So don't use your experience to dismiss the plethora of experiences that are out there where people have experienced racism. Don't use your individual situation and experience to dismiss the plethora of people who have experienced racism in Saudi Arabia. I have, and every other student of knowledge that I know of that have lived in that environment have experienced some level, some form of racism. Blatantly, they tell you in their newspaper that they are looking for ESL teachers, English as a second language teachers, and they only prefer whites. They tell you right there in their newspaper. So you are discriminating against a person simply because, not based upon qualification, not based upon the person's qualification, but simply based upon the color of the person's skin. And then you have the audacity to post on Twitter, to post on the social media, oh, there's no racism. Look at Saudi Arabia. The king is kissing a black man on the head. And you'll use that isolated incident to dismiss the plethora of experiences whereby people have experienced blatant, overt racism. The whole system. We're not talking about individuals. We're talking about an entire system. Which brings me to my point, and that is that we look at racism, we're conflating racism with individual prejudice and bigotry. Big difference between an individual being prejudiced against you. They don't like you because you're Hispanic, or they don't like you because you're black, or they don't like you because you're dark-skinned, Haitian, or you're dark-skinned Trinidadian, and they're light-skinned or fair-skinned. They don't like you because you're Guyanese, and that's individual prejudice, bigotry. That's not what I'm talking about when we're talking about racism. Racism, we're talking about as an entire system of oppression. We're talking about systemic, across the board, systematic racism, structural racism that is rooted into the systems that govern societies. You guys need to really do your history. You guys really need to do some reading before you jump out on social media and make a donkey out of yourself. You guys really need to, if you knew how you looked in the eyes of people who can see your ignorance, it's really sad. If you really understood how people see you and your ignorance, because you don't have a clue what you're talking about. Probably haven't read one book on systematic or systemic racism, structural racism. Not one book have you read. You're going based upon of conversations you have with other people and based upon your limited experiences. Go read a book. The first commandment here again given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Iqra, read. Read before you jump out on social media. Read before you jump out on social media. Because some of you guys are making yourselves look like complete idiots. And it's going to make it very difficult for someone like me to welcome you back into the African-American Muslim community after you have spent so many years of your life promoting Saudi Arabia. It's almost like people get paid, like you're being paid to advertise for Saudi Arabia. That's almost what it seems like. And it's really sad. Because as an African-American, you don't realize how dismissive you are to an entire plight, an entire struggle of a group of people. But we're talking about a system of racism that is rooted in the systems that govern a society. We're talking about financial institutions that discriminate against black folks. We're talking about the educational institutions. Princeton University, check this out. Princeton University just named its first black valedictorian in the school's 274-year history. We're talking about Princeton University, one of the most prestigious universities in America, has been open for 274 years. And here now in 2020, they're announcing their first black valedictorian. If that is not structural, if that is not systematic racism, then I don't know what is. So you mean to tell me within a period of 274 years, and you can't even count the whole first, of that, because when was the first black person allowed to go to Princeton? You count from there. You can't even count 274 years ago, because 274 years ago, we were still in slavery. So when the university was first introduced, when the university first opened, black people weren't even allowed to go to the university, much less be educated. So you're talking about what? Within the past 100 years, you've only had one valedictorian that was black, or one that you chose to recognize. You understand? You understand systematic racism? That certain jobs will turn you down just based upon your name. Certain universities will turn you down even if your grades are top tier. You're scoring at a 4.0, the 4.0 average, the highest average that you can have academically, and it will still deny you entry into their university simply based upon your name or based upon your skin complexion. That's the systematic racism that we're talking about. We're not even talking about the prison industrial complex where almost 90% or 88% of the people incarcerated in America are African Americans. Meanwhile, we only make up between 13 to 18% of the population. You go figure. Almost 90% of the people that are incarcerated are African Americans. Yet we only make up a quarter, less than a quarter of the percentage of the American population. You go figure. And this is where all of our men are. All of our black men are. All of our African American men are. This is where we're at. And then we'll say, oh, there's no racism in Islam. So the fact that a non-black Muslim can say that there's no racism in Islam, to overshadow the fact that many Muslims are in fact racism, is indicative of the privilege that they benefit from to even utter those words. Stop pandering to white fragility, all right, which ignores the obvious and dismisses the oppressed. I'll end with this hadith to show you how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with this. On the authority of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he said that when Abu Sufyan converted to Islam, Abu Sufyan wanted to, or he was on his way to Medina to go talk with the Prophet ﷺ about renewing the peace treaty. His daughter, Habiba, married the Prophet ﷺ, so he stopped to see his daughter in Medina. Now Abu Sufyan is one of the chiefs of Mecca, the chiefs of Quraysh, right? So he's on his way to Medina. And in Medina, he passes by a group of the Sahaba. And they were Suhaib al-Rumi, Bilal ibn Abi Rabah, and Salman al-Farisi. Salman al-Farisi was something that these three men had in common. Salman al-Farisi was Persian. Suhaib al-Rumi was from Rome. And Bilal ibn Abi Rabah was from Abyssinia, was from Ethiopia. What does those three men have in common? None of them were Arabs. And if they were not an Arab, they were seen as the lowest of the low from that society. And when Abu Sufyan walked by these three individuals, one of them said to the other, "Ma ukhidat suyufullah ma khadaha." That if Abu Sufyan is still alive, then that means that the swords of Allah did not do their justice. If Abu Sufyan is still alive, then that means that the swords of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not do their justice. Meaning, they were remembering the atrocities that they suffered at the hands of Abu Sufyan. The oppression, the prejudice, the discrimination, the persecution, everything that they experienced at the hands of Abu Sufyan. They remember that just by seeing him. Sometimes seeing a person will trigger you. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he jumped up and he went over to Suhaib and he went over to Bilal and he went over to Suhaib and Bilal and Salman al-Farisi. And he said, "Are you going to speak to one of the chiefs of Mecca like that? How dare you? Do you know who he is?" You see what's happening here. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, without thinking, is completely dismissing the pain of those companions and what they experienced. He's dismissing their pain because he's looking at pandering and placating the feelings of Abu Sufyan because he was a new Muslim and he was from the chiefs of Mecca. He didn't want Abu Sufyan to hear something that would perhaps turn him away from Islam. So he was more concerned with Abu Sufyan remaining a Muslim than he was the feelings and the sentiments of the people who had suffered so much at the hands of Abu Sufyan. This is wrong. So when you say there's no racism in Islam, you are completely dismissing the people who have had horrible experiences in their lives with racism from Muslims. Be mindful of your dismissal. Be mindful of your dismissive comments because of your own personal experiences. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu jumped up into the face of Suhaib and Bilal and he said, "You talk like that to one of the chiefs of Quraysh?" Totally overlooking their pain and their trauma that they suffered at the hands of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He went over to the Prophet ﷺ and he told the Prophet what happened. And the Prophet ﷺ looked at Abu Bakr and he said, لَعَلَّكَ يَا أَبَا بَكْرَ قَدْ أَغْضَبْتَهُمْ. He said, perhaps Abu Bakr, you angered them. Perhaps you made them angry. Perhaps you upset them. Perhaps your dismissal of their pain, perhaps you upset them. And Abu Bakr realized at that moment what he did, how he dismissed their pain, how he dismissed their trauma, how he dismissed their experience with Abu Sufyan simply because he wanted to pander and placate the feelings of Abu Sufyan. The Prophet ﷺ was a people's champion. He was a people's champion. He told Abu Bakr, لَعَلَّكَ يَا أَبَا بَكْرَ قَدْ أَغْضَبْتَهُم. He said, perhaps Abu Bakr, you angered them. Perhaps you angered them. Do you realize what you did by doing that? You came to me to tell me what they said about Abu Sufyan, but did you for once stop and take a look at what you did to them? Perhaps you angered them. You upset them for what you did. And Abu Bakr kind of realized, he thought for a moment, wow, I never thought about it like that. And he went back to Suhaib and Bilal and Salman and he said, أَغْضَبْتُكُمْ. Did I anger you? Did I upset you? Did I offend you guys with what I said? And they said to Abu Bakr, no, يَغْفِرُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ يَغْفِرُ اللَّهُ لَكْ يَا Abu Bakr. May Allah forgive you, Abu Bakr. No, we're good. We're good, Abu Bakr. But he learned a lesson, and that's not to dismiss somebody's experience because you are looking at it from your lens. Your lens is not the determining factor, brothers and sisters. Stop saying there's no racism in Islam. Stop saying that there are no racism in Islam. Stop saying there's no racism in Islam when we clearly can see that some Muslims are in fact racist. We can clearly see that. And let's begin addressing that within our own communities. Don't jump out and start protesting and say you stand in solidarity with George Floyd and this movement that's going on. Don't jump on the movement and forget what the movement, the concept of the whole movement. If you're going to address racism, then address racism within your own ranks within the Muslim community. Stop ignoring the racism that is here and jump out like Superman and address the racism on the larger scale, the larger platform. And we can't address the racism on a large, we can't take you serious. You can't be taken serious as an imam, as a champion of the people, if you are not addressing the dilemma of the people within your own rank. That is what I'm saying. I respect anybody who stands up in the face of oppression and in the face of injustice. I respect that. But what's even more honorable, what is even more admirable, is when you address the racism right here within your own ranks. And when you guys are ready to have a conversation about that, I see New Jersey Dawah put out a post. I see Fulan put out a post and this one put out a post and all of these people, we stand in solidarity. Nah, let's have a conversation within our own ranks. Let's have a conversation about the racism, with the blatant racism, the overt racism within our own ranks. You can't jump out there and address Black Lives Matter and go all black on Tuesday and stand in solidarity with African Americans because you're riding the wave and the people within the Muslim community can see your hypocrisy. I'm not calling anybody a hypocrite. I'm saying it's hypocritical to say that Black Lives Matter and you stand in solidarity with black people and you stand in solidarity with George Floyd and you stand in solidarity with people who are being oppressed, but yet you totally overlook and dismiss what is happening right within your own ranks in the Muslim community. I'm saying to me, that is hypocritical. So when you ask me, oh, why you say this about this imam or why you say that about that imam, now you know. I'm not with the fake activism, the selective activism. If we're going to address racism, let's address it all around the board. Let's have a conversation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our sins. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our transgressions and our injustices, whether those injustices that we are aware of or the injustices that we are not aware of. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower the Muslim community here in America, shower us with his mercy and with his compassion and give us the ability to be more open and honest with one another. We need honest conversations right now. We need uncomfortable conversations right now amongst each other. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى اللهم إنا نسألك الجنة وما قرب إليها من قول وعمل ونعوذ بك من النار وما قرب إليها من قول وعمل اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على عبدك ورسولك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة